Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into one of the darkest and most twisted stories from 1847, the story of a widow who used her tallest slave to manipulate a terrifying legacy that haunted her own daughters for years. This isn't just rumor or legend, every detail comes from painstaking research into historical records. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? And make sure to subscribe, because uncovering these true, shocking stories takes a lot of work and dedication. In 1847, the widow at the center of this story was not just any wealthy woman, she was someone who wielded her influence like a weapon. Widowed early, she inherited a large estate, including numerous enslaved people, but her ambition and desire for dominance extended far beyond mere wealth. She was fixated on controlling every aspect of her household, from the movements of her daughters to the behaviors of the enslaved people she owned. Nothing happened under her roof without her knowledge and, more importantly, her approval. Her obsession with control was rooted partly in fear of losing her status, fear of disobedience, and fear that her family's reputation could be tarnished by scandal or weakness. But it was also deeply personal. She believed that the only way to secure her legacy was to mold those around her into extensions of her will. Every interaction, every chore, and every decision in the household was carefully orchestrated to reinforce her authority. This need for control wasn't limited to ordinary management. It was psychological. She instilled fear, not just respect, among those who lived on her estate. The enslaved people were constantly aware that any failure to meet her expectations could result in severe punishment, while her daughters were taught that submission to her rules was synonymous with survival. By combining intimidation with manipulation, she effectively turned the entire household into a living embodiment of her power. It was this obsession that ultimately set the stage for her most sinister scheme, using her tallest slave as a tool to enforce her dominance and shape the minds and lives of her own children. Her fixation on control became more than just personal ambition, it became a legacy she sought to engrave into every corner of her home, one that would haunt her family for generations to come. Among the many enslaved people on the widow's estate, one individual stood out above the rest, her tallest male slave. He was not just physically imposing, there was something about his presence that drew attention. His height and strength made him naturally intimidating, and the widow recognized the potential to use him as an instrument of her control. But her interest was not simply utilitarian, it was deeply strategic, even sinister. She saw in him a tool she could use to manipulate her daughters and maintain an iron grip over the household. The widow began observing him carefully, testing his reactions and assessing how his physical presence could influence the others around him. She noticed that even minor gestures from him could provoke fear, obedience, or hesitation among the enslaved people and her own children. Rather than relying on conventional punishments or threats, she realized she could use his stature as a living symbol of her authority, a silent enforcer who carried the weight of her will without her needing to act directly. Her plan was meticulous. She positioned him in moments of intimidation, during household discipline, when her daughters needed to be reminded of hierarchy, or when she wanted to send a clear message to the other enslaved workers. In essence, she weaponized his body as an extension of her control. Every glance, every movement, and every enforced task he performed under her instruction reinforced the widow's presence and power, even when she was not physically there. This selection was more than just choosing the strongest or tallest slave, it was about psychological manipulation. By using him, she created an environment where fear and obedience were intertwined with awe. Her daughters grew up under the shadow of his height and authority, internalizing lessons about dominance and submission that would shape their lives long after the widow herself was gone. In this way, the tallest slave became the cornerstone of her secret, sinister strategy to shape a legacy built not on love or guidance, but on intimidation and control. Once the widow had singled out her tallest slave as a tool of influence, she carefully integrated him into the daily life of the household in ways that went far beyond ordinary labor. His presence became a living reminder of her authority, a silent enforcer whose mere appearance could control behavior without the widow needing to raise her voice. He was no longer just an enslaved worker, he was an instrument of fear and psychological manipulation. Whenever the widow wanted her daughters to comply with her strict rules, she would have the tallest slave positioned nearby. His towering figure, often looming in doorways or silently observing tasks, made it nearly impossible for anyone to act with independence. Simple acts of disobedience or hesitation were met with a glance or a subtle step forward from him, sending immediate messages of intimidation. Children and adults alike learned quickly that defiance could bring consequences far worse than mere scolding. They internalized the widow's authority through the slave's physical dominance, but the widow didn't limit his role to her daughters alone. He was used to maintain a strict hierarchy among the other enslaved people on the estate as well. Minor mistakes, failure to follow orders, or signs of resistance were swiftly met with his involvement. Often, he would execute tasks with exaggerated precision or show his physical might, a constant, looming presence that reminded everyone of the widow's control and the consequences of stepping out of line. This manipulation extended even further into the household's social dynamics. The widow understood that fear could be just as effective as punishment. By strategically using the slave to intimidate, she created an atmosphere where obedience became instinctual. Her daughters, conditioned from an early age to respond to the silent authority he embodied, carried these lessons into adulthood, shaping their perceptions of power, fear, and submission. The household operated like a carefully orchestrated stage, with the tallest slave cast as the unspoken enforcer, ensuring that her will was obeyed without constant direct intervention. Through this system, the widow achieved a terrifying efficiency. She could maintain control, instill fear, and shape behavior across generations, all through a single, towering figure who acted as both her shield and her sword. The psychological impact of this manipulation would haunt her family for years, creating patterns of dominance and intimidation that extended far beyond her own lifetime. The widow's influence over her daughters went far beyond ordinary discipline or parental guidance. She understood that fear, when wielded correctly, could shape minds and personalities in ways that obedience alone could not. By using her tallest slave as a tool of intimidation, she created a constant, looming presence in her daughters' lives, a living reminder of what defiance could bring. This was not just physical fear, it was psychological, insidious, and deeply effective. From a young age, her daughters were trained to associate the slave's towering figure with consequences. Even before any words were spoken, the sight of him would provoke anxiety, submission, or immediate compliance. Tasks that might have seemed mundane, cleaning, organizing, or following the widow's intricate household rules, became exercises in mental tension, where the daughters had to anticipate not just the widow's reactions but also the silent judgment of the slave. The widow reinforced this system by combining intimidation with subtle emotional manipulation. She would praise obedience lavishly, making her daughters crave approval, while making the smallest mistakes or hesitation feel catastrophic through the slave's looming presence. Over time, her daughters internalized this control, learning to police their own behavior constantly. The fear became internalized, embedding a sense of vigilance, guilt, and dread that persisted long after direct supervision. This psychological conditioning extended beyond mere fear of punishment. The widow's daughters grew up learning that power was synonymous with control, and that submission was the safest path. The slave was central to this lesson, a figure who represented not just the widow's authority, but the very concept of dominance itself. They were taught to anticipate danger, to obey instinctively, and to live under the shadow of someone who could act on the widow's will at any moment. The long-term impact of this manipulation was profound. Her daughters were molded into individuals whose behaviors, relationships, and decisions were influenced by the patterns of fear instilled in their childhood. The widow had effectively created a psychological blueprint, a legacy of control and intimidation that would persist across generations, all rooted in the silent, omnipresent authority of the tallest slave. The widow's obsession with control and manipulation went beyond her immediate household. It was about creating a lasting legacy. She was determined that her family, particularly her daughters, would inherit not just her wealth, but her philosophy of power, one built entirely on fear, dominance, and psychological control. Every action she took, every method of intimidation she employed, was carefully designed to be internalized and passed down as a blueprint for future generations. By using her tallest slave as a central figure in this system, the widow embedded a constant, physical symbol of authority into her daughter's upbringing. He was more than a servant, he was a living lesson in power dynamics. The daughters grew up learning that authority could be enforced silently, through presence and intimidation, rather than words or reasoning. The widow taught them that fear was a tool, and cruelty, when applied strategically, could shape behavior far more effectively than kindness or persuasion. The household itself became a crucible for this philosophy. Daily routines, punishments, and even casual interactions were orchestrated to reinforce the principles she wanted her daughters to inherit. Every glance, every reprimand, and every demonstration of strength from the tallest slave served as a reminder of the widow's worldview, that survival, influence, and legacy depended on control, dominance, and the careful manipulation of those weaker or more vulnerable. Over time, the daughters began to internalize these lessons, not as imposed rules, but as natural truths. They observed, absorbed, and gradually began to emulate the widow's methods in subtle ways, perpetuating the cycle of fear and intimidation. By the time the widow passed or withdrew from active control, her daughters were already equipped to continue her legacy, carrying forward a household culture steeped in psychological manipulation and cruelty. In this way, the widow did not just manage her estate, she engineered a lineage of influence that would echo through her family for decades. Her legacy was not measured in wealth or property alone, but in the enduring imprint of fear, control, and the chilling knowledge that power could be enforced silently, through presence, obedience, and the lessons instilled during childhood. The shadow of her methods would linger long after her death, leaving a mark on her daughters that was as much psychological as it was familial. If you want, I can continue with Keynote 6 next, fully detailed, so your script remains ready. The widow's methods of control extended far beyond what anyone outside her household could ever suspect. She didn't rely solely on visible authority or the looming presence of her tallest slave. She also developed secret rituals and hidden punishments designed to reinforce obedience and terror in a way that was invisible to outsiders. These practices were a crucial part of her strategy to maintain dominance over her family and enslaved people while preserving the estate's outward appearance of normalcy. Within the confines of her estate, the widow orchestrated punishments that were psychologically calculated. Minor mistakes by her daughters or the enslaved people were met not just with reprimands, but with staged scenarios where fear and uncertainty were amplified. The tallest slave was often employed in these moments, appearing unexpectedly, remaining silent yet imposing, or carrying out tasks that reminded the household of the widow's omnipresence. Every punishment was designed to create a lasting memory, ensuring that the lesson would linger long after the immediate incident. These secret rituals were more than just disciplinary measures, they were a system of behavioral conditioning. The widow would time punishments carefully, use isolation, and manipulate sensory experiences, dimly lit rooms, sudden silences, or the deliberate positioning of individuals, to heighten the impact. The goal was to instill deep-seated anxiety and compliance, training her daughters and the enslaved people to respond instinctively to authority. Importantly, these practices were hidden from the outside world. Visitors to the estate, neighbors, and even distant relatives might have assumed it was a normal, well-run household, unaware of the subtle terror embedded in daily life. This secrecy allowed the widow to maintain her reputation while continuing her sinister influence behind closed doors. The hidden nature of these rituals also added to their psychological power. The uncertainty of not knowing what might happen next created a constant state of tension that further reinforced obedience. Through these secret rituals and punishments, the widow created an environment where fear became habitual, and control was absolute. The lessons learned in these hidden moments shaped behavior in ways that could not be seen, measured, or easily escaped. By combining visible intimidation with covert strategies, she ensured that her influence would endure, leaving a lasting imprint on her daughters and the enslaved people under her control. While the widow maintained tight control within her household, the impact of her actions did not remain confined to her estate. Over time, her methods, her obsession with dominance, and the unusual presence of her tallest slave began to stir whispers and unease among the local community. Neighbors, local merchants, and even extended families started noticing oddities: the way her daughters behaved, the strict routines in her household, and the intimidating figure who seemed ever present, yet rarely spoke in public. The widow's reputation as a shrewd and controlling woman gradually transformed into something more sinister in the eyes of outsiders. Rumors began circulating that the household operated under a strict code of fear, and that the tallest slave played a key role in enforcing it. Some neighbors reported seeing the slave positioned in ways that seemed deliberately menacing, while others spoke of the daughter's rigid, almost robotic behavior, as though they were under constant surveillance and manipulation. This tension intensified as the widow's influence grew. People were simultaneously fascinated and frightened by her methods. Some envied her authority and wealth, while others suspected cruelty or darker motives at play. The widow, however, appeared indifferent to the growing scrutiny. She continued to use fear as her primary tool, ensuring that anyone who might question her household would think twice before interfering. The local community's awareness of her tactics created a subtle but constant pressure. The widow's use of intimidation through the tallest slave and her secretive punishments made her daughters and the enslaved people appear compliant and loyal, masking the underlying terror. Yet, outsiders could sense that something was off, a tension that spoke of control far beyond what was typical for the time. This delicate balance between concealment and influence allowed the widow to dominate not only her household but also maintain a psychological edge over those watching from the outside. Ultimately, the widow's growing tension with the local community reflected the dangerous power of her methods. Her control was not just about fear within the walls of her estate, but also about projecting an aura of authority and unpredictability beyond them, ensuring that her influence remained unchallenged and her legacy firmly in place. While much of the story focuses on the widow and her daughters, it's crucial to understand the perspective of the tallest slave, the very person at the heart of her schemes. For him, life on the estate was a constant struggle between survival and forced compliance. Though physically powerful, he had no agency within the structure of the household. He was bound by the constraints of slavery and the widow's calculated control. Yet, paradoxically, he was given a role of immense influence, acting as both an enforcer and an instrument of fear. From his point of view, every day was fraught with tension. He was expected to project authority and intimidation without the liberty to express his own will. His compliance was non-negotiable, yet he had to appear willing, almost willing to serve the widow's designs as if it were his choice. One misstep could mean punishment not only for himself but could escalate the widow's wrath against others in the household. His body, his height, and his presence were weaponized, turning him into a symbol of terror rather than a human being with his own desires. At the same time, the slave's central role in the widow's plans placed him in a complicated moral position. He was feared by the daughters and other enslaved people, yet his actions were dictated entirely by the widow. He likely experienced internal conflict, witnessing the suffering he was forced to perpetuate while simultaneously trying to protect himself from the widow's unpredictable cruelty. Every interaction, every look, and every physical gesture had to be calculated. He had to maintain the widow's desired aura of authority while concealing his own fear, anger, or frustration. Despite the immense pressure, he became indispensable to the widow's control. Her daughters and the other household members learned obedience not from her alone, but from the silent, looming presence he embodied. His height and physicality, combined with the widow's strategic direction, amplified the psychological impact on everyone around him. Yet behind this facade of power, he remained trapped, a person forced to act as both a tool and a symbol, stripped of agency and recognition for his own humanity. Through his perspective, the story reveals the human cost of the widow's obsession. Her ability to manipulate others through fear and intimidation relied on exploiting his body and presence, demonstrating the cruel ingenuity of her methods. The tallest slave's life became a paradox, central to the household's control yet profoundly powerless, a living embodiment of the widow's sinister legacy. The widow's manipulation and use of her tallest slave to enforce fear left deep psychological scars on her daughters, shaping not only their childhoods but also the people they would become. Growing up under constant surveillance, intimidation, and psychological pressure, the daughters internalized lessons about power, obedience, and control that would influence their entire lives. Their understanding of relationships, trust, and authority was filtered through the lens of fear, making normal emotional bonds difficult to establish. The daughters learned that authority was something to be feared rather than respected, and that submission often ensured safety. These lessons carried into their interactions beyond the household. Friendships and potential romantic relationships were approached cautiously, filtered through a subconscious expectation that people could be both protective and punitive. The psychological imprint of the widow's control often manifested as anxiety, hypervigilance, or a compulsive need to anticipate the reactions of others, mirroring the tension they experienced under the widow's watchful eye. Moreover, the shadow of the tallest slave remained a constant reminder of the lessons drilled into them. Even after the widow's direct influence waned, memories of his looming presence and the fear he symbolized continued to shape the daughters' understanding of power and hierarchy. They carried the sense that dominance could be exercised silently, that authority could be enforced physically, and that survival often depended on navigating complex systems of intimidation, a mindset that inevitably affected their parenting, social interactions, and community relationships. The long-term effects were not just psychological but also relational. The daughters were often wary of expressing vulnerability, trusting others fully, or challenging authority in any meaningful way. The family patterns established by the widow, control, fear, and manipulation, became intergenerational, influencing how they would raise children, manage households, and interact with those around them. The widow's legacy, cemented through the terrifying use of the tallest slave, proved enduring, demonstrating how the strategic use of intimidation and psychological control can ripple across time, shaping the emotional and relational development of future generations. The widow's legacy persisted long after her death. Neighbors, former household members, and oral histories remembered her cruelty and the towering figure of the tallest slave. Her daughters, shaped by fear and psychological conditioning, continued patterns of control that reinforced the legend. Stories of the household became cautionary tales, a mix of fact and myth, about unchecked power and the manipulation of those under one's control. The widow's influence endured not through wealth alone, but as a psychological imprint that haunted her family and the local community for decades. Her story remains a chilling reminder of the long shadow that fear, control, and manipulation can cast across generations. The widow's methods, her use of the tallest slave, and the psychological conditioning of her daughters did not end with her death or disappearance from the historical record. Instead, the impact of her actions lingered, leaving a legacy that became the stuff of whispered stories and local legend. Those who had lived through the household, whether as neighbors, visitors, or former household members, carried with them memories of the fear and control that had defined the estate. Over time, these stories evolved, blending fact with the natural exaggeration of retelling, until the widow's household was remembered as a place of almost mythical cruelty and manipulation. The daughters, deeply affected by their upbringing, continued to influence the community, sometimes unknowingly replicating the patterns of control they had been taught. Their behavior and mannerisms, shaped by fear and the constant presence of authority figures, made outsiders uneasy, perpetuating the narrative of the widow's dark legacy. The tallest slave, though no longer a central figure in active memory, became a symbol in these stories, representing the inescapable power of the widow and the ways in which she controlled her household. Even decades later, local accounts and oral histories recounted the chilling presence of the household. People would speak of the widow's daughters and the enigmatic figure of the tallest slave, recalling how fear and obedience had dominated life on that estate. The legend highlighted not just the cruelty of one woman, but the psychological machinery she had built, capable of shaping minds, behaviors, and relationships for generations. The story persisted as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power, the manipulation of those under one's control, and the haunting ways fear can become a family inheritance. Ultimately, the widow's actions ensured that her legacy was far more than material wealth. It was a psychological imprint, a story of dominance and terror that survived through memory and myth. Even today, the tale of the widow, her tallest slave, and the daughters she molded continues to fascinate and horrify, reminding us that history often carries lessons in the shadows of human cruelty, influence, and manipulation. As the daughters grew older, they began to test the boundaries of the control that had dominated their childhood. The lessons of fear and obedience were deeply ingrained, but human resilience and curiosity sometimes challenged them. Some daughters attempted to assert autonomy in subtle ways, questioning household rules quietly, defying expectations when no one was watching, or seeking emotional connections outside the household. These attempts were met with tension, guilt, and sometimes punishment, as the psychological grip of their upbringing was strong. Even in moments of independence, they carried the shadow of the tallest slave and the widow's authority, making rebellion complicated and fraught with risk. Yet these small acts of defiance revealed cracks in the carefully constructed system of fear, showing that even the most meticulous control could not completely erase individual will. Over time, the widow's household became a story in local folklore. Neighbors and visitors shared tales of the imposing household, the daughter's strange demeanor, and the tallest slave's intimidating presence. With each retelling, the story gained layers of myth and exaggeration, transforming from a real-life account of cruelty into a cautionary legend. The community's perception evolved from curiosity to fear to almost reverence for the story. The estate became symbolic of the dangers of unchecked power, psychological manipulation, and the consequences of absolute control. Even long after the family was gone, locals recounted eerie tales about the daughters and the household, cementing the widow's influence as a psychological and cultural legacy that outlasted her lifetime. The story of the widow, her tallest slave, and her daughters offers more than historical intrigue. It is a study in human psychology. It demonstrates how fear and manipulation can be used to control not only actions but thoughts, emotions, and relationships. The widow understood the mechanics of power, using the slave as a tool to instill obedience and internalized control. Her story also reveals the long-term consequences of such manipulation. The daughter's behavior, social interactions, and emotional health were shaped by experiences designed to intimidate and dominate. It is a cautionary tale, reminding us that authority, when wielded without empathy, can leave enduring scars. The legend that survives in Mississippi serves as both a historical account and a psychological lesson. Fear can be weaponized, power can be subtle and pervasive, and the human mind can carry the echoes of trauma across generations. As the widow grew older, her obsession with control only intensified. She became more meticulous in her strategies, ensuring that every person in her household, from the daughters to the enslaved workers, fully internalized her rules and hierarchy. Her methods became increasingly psychological. She relied less on overt punishments and more on anticipation, fear, and the symbolic presence of her tallest slave to enforce obedience. In these final years, the daughters were fully shaped into extensions of her will. They carried out household tasks with precision, enforced rules among the enslaved people, and embodied the lessons of fear and submission she had drilled into them. The widow's legacy of terror was fully consolidated, leaving a household where control was absolute and rebellion almost inconceivable. Even those who tried to resist found themselves constrained by years of conditioning and the ever-present reminder of authority through the tallest slave. The widow's story did not fade with her death. Instead, it became a lingering part of local history and cultural memory. Oral accounts, neighborly gossip, and written records all contributed to a legend that emphasized fear, control, and psychological manipulation. The estate, the daughters, and the tallest slave became symbols in the collective imagination, a cautionary tale of the extremes of power and human cruelty. Historians and local storytellers alike note that the widow's methods left enduring marks on the community. The daughters' behaviors, the household patterns, and even the psychological echoes of fear persisted, demonstrating how the manipulation of one generation can ripple across time. Today, the story serves not only as a historical record of cruelty but also as a study in human behavior, power dynamics, and the long-lasting effects of trauma and psychological control. It reminds us that some legacies are measured not in wealth or property, but in the indelible impact left on minds and hearts.